So today we've got two nearly identical Trek Marlins. Obviously this one is completely stock and this one has been modified just a little bit. This one's got some upgrades on it, better cranks, better bottom bracket, upgraded pedals, Advent drivetrain on it, shrimp cranks, single on the front. We've got better hydraulic brakes, some nifty silicone grips, new bar, stem I think is aftermarket too, race face. It's basically, and it's got a dropper post too, so it does have quite a bit of mods into it, but it is totally completely transformed this, from this to this. So I think easily the first thing I would do is probably swap out to wider tires. Obviously the front fork is pretty good for beginners, but as soon as you step up, you're definitely gonna feel the difference between the aftermarket front fork. Completely different bike when you upgrade it. The factory brakes are very well ventilated, stop very quickly. Don't get me wrong, I think the factory fork on the Treks are great, especially if you're a beginner rider. As you get better, you'll definitely probably want to upgrade. It just becomes the fact of, how much do you want to upgrade this bike that's probably sub $700 to $900, but with a few mods, you can make a very nimble, very comfortable hardtail to add to your fleet. The gear shifts are actually really good on the factory Trek. I mean, I had no problem shifting through any of the gears, so I think any intermediate or beginner is gonna love the drivetrain on this bike. The brakes grab really nicely, and they lock up really good. So the entry level lower end Marlins come with mechanical brakes, and I believe the Marlin 6 and Marlin 7 all have the hydraulic brakes. They do the RST Sun Tour type forks on there, which in my opinion for newbies does great. However, compared to the aftermarket forks, there's a huge difference. It starts to feel a little bit jumpy and hoppy versus some of the aftermarket forks, which can get pretty pricey, but you feel a huge difference. Obviously the 29er, it rolls over anything. I mean, stumps, whatever, bumps, it just feels to roll over it very naturally. So I love kind of going trail riding on the 29ers. And I love 26ers, but the 29er has its place for sure with the rolling power. One of the first things that I like to do on any bike really is remove the 3x in the front. I definitely think that the Advent shifter kit with the 1x setup on the front, in my opinion, I would much rather go that than stay with the 3x8 setup on the factory. Even if you're not going to do a lot of hill climbing, you can probably get by with just the 1x8 if you don't want to spend any money. But to save money, you can shift to the middle ring and just try it out. However, if you're going over a lot of hills, you will want to keep the 3x8 unless you want to spend the extra cash to jump up to, which will give you a lot more climbing power, make it a lot easier so you're not huffing and puffing up the hills. Obviously I felt a pretty big difference between the factory Marlin 6 hydraulic brakes and these kind of upgraded Shimanos. These are the Shimano Diors, which are a little bit of a step up between that. They seem to lock up pretty quick. I do like wider tires on my mountain bike, so these factory I think come with a 29 by 2.0, which is a 2-inch wide. You start stepping up to like something like the 2.2 or even a 2.4. These forks will probably, I imagine you could run a 2.4 with no rub problems on this. It looks like front and rear. The rear's probably got enough clearance. But I really do like to have a little bit bigger tread to get over for some traction. Obviously, if you go by 1x setup, you can add a dropper seat post on here. Obviously this one, you'd have to go with the external dropper seat post, which basically routes the cable through the external portion of the bike. You have to run it on the frame versus running it internally. I don't usually like to recommend drilling into the bike you can, but I'd rather leave the frame intact. If you want to step up to some better flat pedals, some of the factory pedals are usually just the plastic. So get a little bit more real estate on your feet with some metal pegs for some additional traction so that you don't have your feet slip off, which is nice. If you remove the 3x, you're limiting your drivetrain, your gear ratios quite a bit. So if you're doing climbing and don't want to step up the rear cassette and the derailleur to a 10 or 11 speed, you're going to see, you know, quite a bit of gear ratio kind of limitations there, especially if you're doing a lot of hill climbs. You'll definitely stay with the 3x setup. A lot of the 1x8s, in all honesty, I can climb a lot of hills and not be gassed by the time that I get to the top. So typically when you swap these out, if these are the 4x104 BCDs, you can get those chain rings on either like a 28 tooth, a 30 tooth, or a 32 tooth. Typically a 32 tooth is probably very similar to the middle ring, so if you want to try it out, you can just leave it on the middle ring and run through your 8 in the back, and you'll basically know what a 1x8 would feel like going up the hill. But if you're, you know, doing a lot of hill climbs and trails with hills, I would leave the 3x8 unless you plan to upgrade to the 1x10 or 1x11, so that you have kind of the wider chain or the larger chain rings on the back to get that lower gearing for the hill climbs. Obviously you start stepping up to something like the cranks, you start spending a little bit more money. I really do like going to a narrow wide chainring on the front. In my opinion though, these Marlins are actually great bikes. Really smooth, easy to ride, fairly light. The colors that they have are actually pretty bright. I picked the orange just because I wanted to kind of stand out a bit, but you know, the factory, you get Bontrager tires on it, which have pretty good tread. The RST fork is pretty decent, but you will start noticing a big difference once you kind of play on another bike that has an upgraded fork. In all honesty though, you can pick kind of your modifications as you go. However, for somebody that's just learning and getting started, I think these Marlins are pretty solid bikes. Seriously solid bike for the money that you get.